It's certainly a privilege to be hosting this really important dialogue, and I love how the dialogue has been framed about moving beyond the rhetoric and creating a diverse workplace in the 21st century. I think that's a really great place to start for us, and I think it's fair to say that creating a diverse and inclusive workplace is, or should be, a fundamental goal for every company or organization that wants to succeed today. And there's certainly a variety of reasons why we're at such a pivotal moment in society and why diversity and inclusion is an issue that is front and center. In an effort to move beyond the rhetoric, I think we all have to realize that diversity can't just be a numbers strategy. It's not a standalone program with an organization. It's an across-the-board mission. It's about creating a holistic approach to changing a culture and infusing a culture that understands and respects the needs of internal and external stakeholders, managers, staff, customers, users, consumers, and the wider community that surrounds an organization, and the strategies to make sure that everyone is represented, their voices are represented, and they're included at the table when decisions need to be made and implemented. On TV recently, when the Oscars were broadcast, I think many of you probably saw it, Chris Rock highlighted how the entertainment industry, just for an example, is being called on to confront significant gaps in diversity and inclusion, and the lack of diversity in the nominees suggested an industry where there isn't a diverse collection of viewpoints among those who are in critical decision-making positions. Thus, that industry broadly continues to be well behind in understanding the diversity in the audience and the consumers it's trying to market to and embrace. And it's interesting to see what happens and how much of a surprise there is when you have TV shows like Empire or Fresh Off the Boat that are so successful because the decision makers behind those productions do realize their potential audience and what has been historically neglected. And so the challenges and gaps that are seen across a lot of industries where there are a lack of diverse voices and an exclusive leadership as opposed to an inclusive one, they hurt their own enterprise and are missing opportunities to be greater and to be more successful and plan for a sustainable future. In my own experience, as Deborah mentioned, at New York Law School, we've really put diversity and inclusion at the forefront of everything we're doing. Just last year, we adopted the institution's first institutional diversity plan. It's available on our website, and it's not just a plan, it's not just words on paper, but this is, too, a document that embraces our institutional values and our institutional approaches, and we're tracking our progress, and we've seen great success and received a little bit of national recognition already, and I'm really quite proud of that, and look forward to sharing some perspectives as we have our discussion here tonight. So without any further ado, let me discuss the four amazing panelists that we have with us. They're all doing incredible work in their respective industries, and I think the fact that they come from so many different places will really help to shape a broad perspective for you of the different ways that organizations are going about thinking about diversity and inclusion and implementing the right programs and approaches to achieving it and sustaining it over time. So first, let me introduce Erika Irish Brown. She is the Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Bloomberg LP. She's responsible for collaborating with senior management to drive the company's global strategy, and she leads the development and implementation of a comprehensive plan that focuses on diversity and inclusion when it comes to recruitment, retention, talent review, succession planning, career development, and training. She's worked for numerous companies, including Morgan Stanley, the US Treasury Department, and Lehman Brothers. Next, to my left is Kristen Titus. She's the founding director of NYC Tech Talent Pipeline, the mayor's $10 million commitment to support the growth of the tech sector. She's the former executive director of Girls Who Code, a national nonprofit working to close the gender gap in technology and engineering. And in its first 18 months of operation, NYC Tech Talent Pipeline has secured funding from 25 corporate and foundation partners and delivered 700% programmatic growth. She's the former consultant to nonprofit organizations, foundations, and corporate partners working at the intersection of philanthropy and technology, and is the former managing director of Jumo.com, the social network for the social sector, from Facebook co-founder Chris Hughes. Next to her is Eulas Boyd. He is the Dean of Admissions at Brooklyn Law School. Bit of a competitor. Brooklyn Law School gave me my start in legal education, and I will be forever grateful. I taught there for 12 years. Previously, Eulas served as the Director of Talent Acquisition and Workforce Planning for the global nonprofit CFA Institute. He's also been the Director of Admissions at Columbia Law School and worked at Goldman Sachs as a Vice President in the Human Capital Management Division, and held a number of critical talent acquisition roles, including co-leading diversity recruiting initiatives across the Americas. Earlier in his career, he was a litigator with Cravath, Loeb & Loeb, and Hahn and Hessen for 9 years following graduation from Harvard Law School. He also taught legal research and writing as an adjunct professor at Cardozo Law School. And finally, Tom Finkelpearl is New York City's Commissioner of Cultural Affairs, and he runs the Department of Cultural Affairs. He oversees city funding for nonprofit arts organizations across the 5 boroughs and directs the cultural policy for New York City. And during his tenure, he's led the city's efforts to review diversity at cultural institutions citywide, and he'll be telling us about some of that pioneering work. And prior to his appointment by Mayor de Blasio, he served as executive director of the Queens Museum for 12 years and oversaw the museum's expansion. He spearheaded efforts to increase access to arts and culture to the surrounding community. So let's begin with the first question. And we'll ask each one of you, given the different backgrounds from which you come, what is diversity and inclusion, and what does it mean in the context in which you work? I'm going to start with Erika first.
Oh, okay. So at Bloomberg, diversity and inclusion is viewed as a business imperative. When we think about D&I, we think about it enabling us to attract, recruit, and retain top talent globally. We think about diversity and inclusion enabling us to create and innovate and make better decisions for our clients. And finally, when we think about how we can connect with our clients and deepen client relationships, we also think that we can leverage our commitment and engagement in diversity and inclusion to do that just the same. So we've taken a real commercial and business approach to diversity and inclusion. We have defined it quite broadly. It is beyond race and gender. It is inclusive of LGBT, age, people with different abilities. It is global, so even how we might think about the many dimensions of diversity and inclusion, it might mean something different in Asia than it does in Europe or Africa. So we do think about it globally, and 40% of our employees are outside of the US, so that's an important dimension to be thinking about. And we also have made it an initiative that is led from the front and from the top. And when I say that, I mean that our chairman, Peter Grauer, is the sponsor of everything that we do in diversity and inclusion. And we approach it as a company when I say lead from the front. So it's not just HR saying, you know, here's your plan, do this. It's every business has a plan that's unique to their business, right? We're a global media company. We're a global financial services company. We're a global tech company. You know, we have so many elements to our business, so there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So we're enabling our business leaders to come up with their plans and objectives based on their needs and the lay of the land for their industry verticals, to be thoughtful in how they approach diversity and inclusion and set both short and long-term goals. So just like Anthony said, you know, you do have to measure progress to ensure that you're making progress, but it is beyond the numbers. So while we will measure things like, you know, representation and the hiring that we do, we also want to measure the engagement of our employees, the involvement of our employees, how we're developing employees, look at who's getting, you know, progressing in their career, why are people leaving. So it's way beyond, it's not just that diversity piece and representation piece, but it's also the inclusion piece. So that, you know, when I think about my team and how we enable the business plans in the business, how we enable our employees to be engaged through our employee networks, which we call communities, how we make sure we connect to the external communities and brand our company and attract talent and create interplay between our employees and the members of these organizations. You know, it's a holistic view that my team enables, but is led from the front and led from the top.
Can you just, one final point. Give us a little perspective on the scale of Bloomberg LP, because I think that's really an important thing to think about building this out across the company. I mean, your tentacles are everywhere.
Yeah, so we're in 192 countries, and we have nearly 17,000 employees around the globe.
How many?
17,000, give or take.
Great, thanks. Kristen.
Sure. So as Anthony said, I lead an initiative of the mayor's called the Tech Talent Pipeline. And our directive directly from the mayor is to ensure the continued growth of the tech sector here in New York City, and to do so by ensuring that we are extending these opportunities to a diverse representation of New Yorkers. That is very broadly defined. But to take a step back and speak to scale here, this is a really important point. New York City has over 300,000 tech jobs, representing $30 billion in wages annually. And over 30,000 businesses here in New York employ some form of tech talent. So when we're looking at our partners, the partners we're working with day in and day out to do this, it spans from the normal folks that you'd recognize, the Googles and Facebooks, to the Goldmans, who employ thousands and thousands of tech workers. And what we're trying to do here is ensure that the 100,000 additional jobs we expect here in New York City are accessible to a diversity of talent. And diversity for us means racial diversity, gender diversity, socioeconomic diversity. We need to ensure that the tech sector, again, very broadly defined, is representative of a diversity of thought, a diversity of opinion, of experience. And at the end of the day, we all want to be engaged with a world of products and services, be it on our phone or in sort of our everyday life, that are designed by people that are not from one background, but represent all of us. And there we see huge opportunity, not only for our businesses, but tremendous opportunity for the people here of New York.
So you're in a unique role where you have to educate and serve as a consultant to leaders who want to do the right thing, who are developing plans, and so that's a very unique perspective versus, and not dissimilar to what Erika does, but in terms of an overall company and being very niche in terms of their unique approaches to the different units within it across all those countries. So Eulas, you work at an academic institution that is an organization in and of itself with many different functions. It has a workplace, it has a faculty, it has students. You recruit students in your principal role as Dean of Admissions, but you also are part of an overall effort that delivers to the legal profession a group of new professionals, lawyers.
That's right. So really...
Tell us how that all works. That's a whole lot to put together, and you're, in a sense, the gatekeeper as to a lot of how that works.
That's exactly right. So I think about diversity really and inclusion across those two contexts. They're related, but they're very different. Because I have a background in human capital management, I think about the law school itself as a social organism and how much more efficient and effective at the mission that it's set for itself if it itself is diverse and inclusive. And so as the person that's primarily responsible for supplying the largest component of that social organism in the student body, we take very seriously the necessity for tactics and strategies that will lead to diverse recruitment in the admissions process. Much of what's already been said in terms of the definitions of the categories of diversity, I certainly agree with. It shouldn't just be about racial and ethnic diversity, although that's critically important for the second reason and the second context really, which is as a representative of one of fewer than 200 institutions that delivers lawyers to the country. The country has just over 1 million lawyers. There's 320 million plus people. There's about 67,000 black lawyers in the country, which is an insufficient amount. I mean, when you think about disparities in things like prosecutorial discretion, I think that becomes the central focus of a conversation, but we need to be looking broader. We have similar disparities in civil representations. We have survey data about attorneys that refuse representations based on unconscious bias that they have in the process of evaluating whether to undertake a representation that leaves, you know, thousands and thousands, if not millions, of people unrepresented in this country. So, you know, we have a philosophy at Brooklyn Law School that may be a little bit inconsistent with much of what people have heard about the legal industry, which is that there aren't enough lawyers, not there's too many. You know, the recession was an incredible disaster for the legal employment sector, and I think it convinced people that there are too many lawyers and too many students in law school. But most people, if you ask them if they have a lawyer to represent them, they don't have one. And you know, as a person that worked in, you know, big law in New York, when someone asks me to refer a lawyer, it's rarely that I don't know a lawyer. It's that I know this person can't afford the lawyer that I know. And that's because there are too few lawyers. And there are certainly too few lawyers of color. And so from a representation standpoint and a recruitment standpoint, I think about the law school and all the things that we need to do to improve the recruitment of students. But we also have to focus on the inclusion elements so that they will succeed in law school, so that they will remain in law school, so they will graduate. When students fail both in undergraduate and in law school, it's not typically because they're academically unprepared. It is typically for social and financial reasons. And so we have to make the right investments as an institution to support the students socially and financially so that they can make it through and then ultimately inhabit many of the organizations and institutions that are themselves suffering from underrepresentation problems. Big law has about 3% African American representation, 1.9% partners, 2.3% Asian representation, I think it is, or 6.7% overall Asian representation, 2.3% partners, something absurd like that. And so in most cases, when an employer says, you know, I can't meet my diversity goals because the pipeline is not there, you should be very skeptical of that response. Sometimes, though, they're telling the truth. You know, when I was in recruitment at Goldman, if someone came to me and said, you need to find me a person of color who is a derivatives attorney in New York, I would look, I mean, there's probably 6 or 7 of them. And it's because the law schools are struggling to recruit that talent, graduate that talent, support that talent, and then the law firms are equally struggling. And so that's part of what we're trying to do, is create a series of strategies and tactics that will ultimately solve that problem.
Just in terms of numbers, what percentage of Brooklyn Law School's students are students of color?
It's in the low 20%. It's about 24%. It's not where we want it to be. You know,
but not insignificant by any means.
It's not.
And that requires a lot of supports and the right infrastructure in the school, and a school that's functioning well to provide those supports.
I think that's right.
And to be inclusive.
I think a lot of the inclusion argument or conversation it's a chicken and the egg problem, right? So the diversity recruitment problem is exacerbated by the inclusion problem, but the inclusion problem is exacerbated by the lack of representation problem.
Yep.
So the students, you need a kind of a critical mass in order for students to feel supported, but you don't have a critical mass so the students don't come. And so you need to solve that problem kind of one student at a time until you get a critical mass. And this is true in employment situations too. So I was at a law firm at one point where it took us a period of maybe 4 years to go from 2 African American attorneys out of 400 to 22. And then probably the foremost invested recruiter, you know, participate in HR event, African American attorneys left the firm. And not too long after that, they were back down to about 4. And part of it is, you know, when students come to that recruitment event and they don't have the conversation they need to have, they make other choices, which is exactly what they should do.
Tom, you preside over an incredible agency that really serves New York City in a way that reaches into every community practically. Give us a sense of what Cultural Affairs does in terms of diversity and inclusion, and how its outreach into the various cultures throughout the city is trying to really drive a sea change, a culture change, if you will. No pun intended.
Okay. So just so people know, Cultural Affairs Department is essentially a funding agency for the arts. There's programs that we do, but so we fund a group of cultural institutions that are on city property. There are 33 of them, includes the Metropolitan Museum and the Museum of Natural History, the zoos, the gardens. It also includes the Queens Museum, the Bronx Museum, Studio Museum in Harlem, El Museo del Barrio. So there's a variety of institutions that we support. There's also a grant program of about $30 million of just, people put in their grants and they're evaluated and grants are given out. But so we actually fund about over 900 organizations. It's the second largest public funding agency for the arts in America. After the federal government, there's New York City. And only San Francisco actually is a rival in per capita spending. So if you imagine that, we're a much bigger city than most, and we're also per capita spending more on culture. So when I arrived, at the agency, one of the, big observations in all the national surveys about diversity in the cultural field is, that even compared to other fields, it's not a diverse field. So we said, in order to, think about diversity, actually there is a numbers game that we had to, what are the real numbers at cultural institutions? How diverse are they? So we got some private funding and we did a survey of 43,000 something employees of these cultural institutions that we fund. And the results were appalling. They were the least white job at cultural institutions is security guard. The next least white is maintenance. The whitest job at cultural institutions is curator, the people making the decisions about the programming. So, part of it, and this, by the way, included all the organizations of color in the city. I'm talking about the entire spectrum. So this is a wake-up call. By the way, I will say that there were some positive points. So as bad as this was, it was considerably better than national averages. But, we're in New York City. It should be way better than national averages. That shouldn't be a benchmark that makes it acceptable as a result. The other thing that was somewhat encouraging is that the people hired most recently, which is a very large number of people hired since 2010, were almost half of that cohort. So there were 21,554 people hired at those institutions since 2010, and 43% of that group self-identified as people of color. So and those are, by the way, the lower-paying new entry-level jobs, so those are not necessarily the best jobs, but there is some hope, or some feeling of hope in that statistic. So with those numbers, so we felt like the first thing we had to do, we're going into a cultural plan for New York City, the first time New York City has done a cultural plan. It'll start at the beginning of next fiscal year. We had to have some statistics about that. There's another study that we're doing, which is called the Social Impact of the Arts Study. This is University of Pennsylvania, has a think tank down there. Most often, people think about the metrics of arts and culture in a city as how does it affect the economy? And that's great, and tourism is fantastic. And by the way, we're all for that. We're going to set a new record in tourism this year, I believe. And the mayor's excited about it. I'm excited about it. I don't want to in any way discount that. And there are major cultural institutions that are driving a lot of that tourism. That's not the only value that arts and culture can have in a city. And everybody who lives in a community that has a cultural center in their community understands that value. But how do you measure that value? And because, like Bloomberg, we are metrics-oriented. We're city government, right? So the social impact of the arts project is able to look at metrics in communities. And these are social impacts. So if you have an arts-rich environment or arts and culture-rich environment in a community, it turns out attendance at school is higher. There's less teen pregnancy. There are less hate crimes. There's all kinds of other. So we're studying New York City as well. And that also then gets, to the point of understanding the value of some of those smaller institutions, often which are taking place in low-income communities of color. So I wanted to say that's sort of what we're doing. Those are some of the studies. We're about to embark on a cultural plan for the city, which understands how the city can further spread the cultural life. And then I just want to say a couple of other things about what diversity means. When I was at the Queens Museum of Art, we made it a priority right from the start. And in fact, the first person I hired was a young woman named Jayashree Abichandani, who was lived very close by and had just worked on the census. This was in about 15 years ago. And she really had connections into the community. And she was almost, even though much younger than me and much more junior, kind of a diversity mentor. And she wasn't officially a diversity worker, but she was. And she was doing programming. And through her social networks, it began to find fantastic candidates for jobs. And we made it a priority. And so within 6 years, we had gotten to the point of excluding maintenance and security. More than 50% of our staff was people of color. And that felt like a breaking point where, so I do think that we're talking about the difference between diversity and inclusion. And it's not a numbers game, but it also sort of is. So that when we had, and by the way, I can't even believe that I could say that we didn't have a fluent Spanish speaker on our staff, aside from maintenance and security when I arrived. It's Corona, we're in Corona. It's a Spanish-speaking community for the most part. So by the time I left, we had Puerto Rican, Dominican, Colombian, Ecuadorian, Mexican. So we had on the staff a real, and racial diversity within Latino, that we had enough critical mass. So quite honestly, when the next person we hired, and we hired, it was much easier to hire people of color because the social networks of the staff, that almost, both because of the atmosphere of inclusion, but also just because, I'm joining a staff where half the people in the halls are chatting in Spanish, and other people are speaking Hindi, and other people are, from different parts of the.
But I would have to think that it has a significant influence on program content, and sort of an understanding of what a community's needs are, and what the cultural touch points are at any point in time. And I do think, one of the things are very context driven.
Yes.
And
so the other thing that did happen during that time was that the audience actually became much bigger and more diverse. It fed on itself. And I mean, the thing that I kind of can't understand, diversity is an opportunity, not a burden. And we saw it that way, and I just don't understand how people could not see it that way. And then so many folks out there say, oh, we're trying, but are they really trying? Are they really looking for those candidates? And one of the things, you were talking about, can you find a qualified lawyer? I never had any problem finding qualified cultural workers to fill those jobs. And I think that there could be a shortage of qualified people of color if everybody was trying, really trying. But right now, there isn't. There are plenty of qualified candidates.
So let's talk about, I want to throw out a word, accountability. Kristen, give us a sense of how one drives accountability and to whom it gets driven in terms of creating a diverse and inclusive workplace. And so whose shoulders does that fall on individually or collectively?
It's a great question, and something that the tech sector has really struggled with in recent years. You speak of sort of creating a baseline, and in the tech industry, when I began this work years ago, there was no baseline. No one was talking about this. I can't tell you how many reporters I called to help dig up the numbers that did not yet exist. And we only saw a real shift in creating some accountability and making clear what the makeup of these companies looked like in the last 2 to 3 years. And part of that was actually Jesse Jackson, believe it or not, who saw a real need and opportunity here and saw the only way for him to create a productive dialogue around this was to actually buy stock in some of these companies that we're talking about and pressure them to release their numbers. And only then did these companies, one, take note of what their workforce looked like, and two, were forced to then share them. And I'm sure you've seen plenty of stories about this now. It's funny and laughable that I had to beg reporters to write about this 5 years ago because it's the cover story of every big publication. And it's the cover story because the numbers are so terrible. You're looking at companies that employ less than 2% of African Americans. You're looking at companies who employ 10 to 20% women. The numbers are really scary. But they weren't just scary to the general public, they're scary to the companies themselves. They fundamentally understand that the future of their products, their services, their companies is reliant upon having a workplace that's reflective of their user base. Twitter's the perfect example. Twitter's user base is heavy on African American populations, but when you look at the makeup of their entire workforce, again, less than 2% is actually representative of this population. How can they produce something for a community for which they do not reflect? And that is where we come in. And I think that accountability is incredibly important. Press, a dialogue, a national dialogue around this is huge. Where we've come in the last 2 years, in the last year, we launched a massive initiative with the president. President Obama launched Tech Hire Initiative, focused on this and this exclusively. We have companies who have hired chief diversity officers. We have dozens and dozens of organizations that are now working toward this mission. But how we hold them accountable, we're looking at those numbers, and many of these companies have pledged to release them regularly. From where I sit, the work that we do is very focused on partnering with those companies, to the point of saying that you can't find someone being not a good enough excuse. We come to those companies saying, we are here to partner with you and help you to do this and do this better and bigger. And what that looks like from our position, we have a platform at the city in which we manage a $500 million workforce system. 1.1 million kids are in the DOE here in New York City. We have tremendous resources to affect change, and let me tell you what it looks like to hold these companies accountable. Google, for instance. Google, we live on Google. We have heard endless stories about how fantastic it is to work at Google. Why don't we make those opportunities available to the people here across the 5 boroughs? When I first started this work, I talked with an HR person inside Google here in New York who told me it was their sole job to hire one black engineer for the entire year, and she failed. She failed. That was her job. And what we do with companies is say, we're here to help you. Google, for instance, when you dig into the numbers, to be an engineer at Google, 99% of engineers employed at Google today say that they had access to computer science education prior to high school. How many of you in this room had computer science education in high school? Exactly. So we have some work to do, and the leverage that we have, again, is using these resources together with these companies and executives at the highest of levels, CEOs who are deeply invested in changing this. The perfect example is we brought together, of our 150 partner companies here in New York, we brought everyone together and built out a plan. We listened and we responded. The mayor announced 6 months ago that all students, all 1.1 million students in the DOE will receive computer science education in elementary, middle, and high school. That is a massive change, but it took working with these companies, holding them accountable, making these numbers available to the general public, and creating a dialogue and platform in which we can change this.
How about at a place like Bloomberg, which its program is new? You are the first head of diversity and inclusion, though the company has had a long commitment to it, but it's more formalized now in terms of a business unit that is trying to have an impact across the enterprise. How do you come in from the outside? How do you drive accountability and change in a new way of thinking about that? Because I think that's something that's, obviously, Kristen's doing that from as an external. Internal, what's that conversation like? What are the challenges like?
Sure. I think much of what Kristen said, we are absolutely on the other side of all of those initiatives, so I don't want to be repetitive, but I do think when you think about creating plans, then you have to be accountable to those plans. So the heads of our businesses do meet with our chairman twice a year to review what the progress is on the plans and have that conversation. I think the other thing I would add is that our chairman asked all of our business heads to have their own personal diversity goals, right? So he believes in people role modeling behavior. right? So it's not just what's on the paper, it's not just what you're asking your teams to do, or that you have diverse slates for every role and things that other people will do, but how are you being a role model in this space and leading, again, from the front and from the top. So I think that that's also an important part of how we've tried to create a culture of inclusion at Bloomberg. I think the other thing, even as an HR leader, I may be the chief diversity officer, but anybody in human resources or in a leadership position at the company should view diversity as part of their job. So it's not just the diversity team's role, you know, to think about diversity when it comes to our company. So every recruiter at our firm is a diversity recruiter because they're responsible for sourcing diverse talent and providing diverse slates for roles at our company. So I think that's the other thing. There are some people with the word diversity in their title, and we may be the thought leaders, the subject matter experts, the center of excellence, but how that permeates throughout everything that we do is business as usual at our company is what we're striving for.
I like that you said that. I think everyone owns diversity.
Right.
And one of the things we did when we had very broad participation in the development of our plan, and then every employee and every student got a copy of the plan, and with the notion that we're all accountable for making this come to life. So yeah. So Eulas, one of the things we had talked about before the panel was the importance of both professional associations, but also affinity groups within organizations. Law schools have affinity groups, but certainly corporations and firms and things like that, they have affinity groups too. What are the roles that they play, and how can we help our audience understand the different kinds of value that's brought and how community can be achieved?
Sure. So I think that I think a lot of people understand that these affinity groups, student organizations within the law school environment or other kinds of academic institutions can provide a support network, a support system for students, a social network. But I think one of the reasons they need that is the actual value of diversity, I think, is misunderstood a little bit. So I think that what diverse environments have in high-performing environments, especially academic environments, business environments, is not just a diversity of perspective. It's also very challenging to interact in a diverse environment. So, I think that yes, diversity is an opportunity, but I think a lot of people do find it burdensome. They do find it challenging. They do find it exhausting. There's some, I don't know how many people are familiar with Catherine Phillips. She's a business school professor at Columbia, and she does a lot of fantastic research on diversity. And she's done some studies that show that if you have racially diverse teams, they typically will reach a higher performing result. But if you ask them how they felt about it, they believe that they had a worse process. So they feel worse about themselves having interacted in that diverse work group, but they produce a better result. So I think, and the other is also true, is that the homogeneous groups that produce a slightly less good work product feel better about their process. They think they did better. And part of that is because they were less challenged. They entered the conversation with the assumption that everybody in the room thought the way that they did, so they didn't work as hard to explain themselves, whereas the diverse groups had to extend themselves constantly to get their points across, and thereby create a more rich conversation and a better result. So I think that the affinity groups, they provide a couple of things. They provide this support system and an opportunity to disengage from that process from time to time. The other thing that I think they do is they help the students that are sort of there to provide, in some respects, they provide diversity to the institution, the organization. They themselves are diverse, and often the diversity of that group of people can get lost in the mission that they undertake to add their diverse perspective to the broader conversation. And so you have this diverse group of Latino students who would sometimes like to be having the conversation about the distinctions between Colombia and Cuba, in Venezuela, but instead are having a conversation that's often about, the broader culture and being Latino, or Caribbean students that are not talking about Jamaica and Trinidad and Haiti, but instead talking about black and white issues. And often they find this opportunity to kind of explore the richness of the diversity that their entire community is actually bringing within the context of the affinity groups. So I think they're clearly a best practice, not just for racial and ethnic diversity, but across all the different strands that we've been talking about. And we make it a point to, one of the programs that we're looking at is making a much greater effort to support all of these groups, because they're not student organizations in the sense that the wine tasting organization is. What they do is interesting and important too, on some level. But for these students, this is critically important to succeeding within the environment.
What are some of the concerns, Kristen, that companies come to you with? I guess one of the things that I always am curious about when thinking about the private sector is what's on the mind of a CEO, and are they sometimes have difficulty engaging in discussions about building diversity. What does inclusion mean? It sort of is, it can be a challenging on a use of that word in a number of ways. It can be a very challenging moment. How do you confront that? How do you get them over that hump sometimes?
Sure, and I think, for many of these CEOs, they have been brought into this conversation in a very public way, and they haven't necessarily been prepared to have that conversation. But what that opportunity brings is again, this level of accountability, and the need to do something immediately and something substantive. But I think the challenges that they bring to us are varied, and much like the Google example I gave, all of these companies recognize that they are not educational or academic institutions. In order to solve this problem, there are broad changes that need to be made inside many verticals. And I think, again, this comes back to the question of accountability. What we then work with these CEOs to do is say, great, we will then sit down with you and rewrite the curriculum at these 14 schools, and you will then hire coming out of them. Or we sit down and say, what needs to be happening in our classrooms in elementary school in order to do this effectively. So the worry on their part is that they truly do not have a pipeline. They understand that they do not have a pipeline. There are some diverse candidates coming in the doors, but by definition of this being a new field and accessibility being very, very limited, they know they have to do something more. And what we do with them is sit down with each CEO and understand, what does growth look like for your company here in New York in the coming years? What do you need? How is one qualified? And help us build a talent pool that is reflective of New York City. And they are very, very invested in doing so, more so than I've seen in the past 5 years. They see a real and urgent need, but it takes work, and it takes buy-in and support, not just from those CEOs, but from presidents of colleges, from the mayor, from a very diverse group of stakeholders. And we're seeing great results, but it takes a village.
Tom, along those lines, one of the things we had talked about earlier was the composition of boards of trustees or boards of directors of culturals. And that can be certainly a challenge to ensure that they are reflective of the communities they serve. Yep. And what are some of the strategies to think about achieving the goals of diversity and inclusion, and what's Cultural Affairs doing, and what are some of the broader goals of some of the organizations you're dealing with? Right.
So, that's a very complicated issue. First of all, our initiative really has to do with workforce on the staff. And I think that's something that's it's more easily achievable, because it's just, there's a certain churn in every institution, and if you make diversity a priority. By the way, I also wanted to echo that diversity in our survey included disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, et cetera. There's very little data available about the there's racial and ethnic diversity data available. The other information is not so available. So here's there are a couple of different issues related to board development. So there's this, basic, fundamental, underlying perception that there are not going to be, lots of billionaires out there or multimillionaires or whatever who are going to be, diverse candidates. So there are, if you sit around in a board development meeting, which I've done a million times at cultural institutions, there are these targets that, everybody is going to be looking at. They're already on a bunch of boards. And so then there are certain risks associated with this board issue. And I've talked to people at the smaller organizations of color, and they say, what we're worried is going to happen is that there's going to be this upward pull, which is going to recruit board members from smaller organizations and saying, there's some possibility you could join our board and maybe do some in-kind, blah, 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 and we're not going to use this. And so these smaller organizations, often organizations of color in other communities aside from central Manhattan, begin to have a depleted board because they're being recruited up into other boards. And this is a big worry with this push right now amongst cultural organizations. So there are a couple of strategies. There are some corporations who have said, we will sponsor board membership if you look for diversity. And so you can actually get somebody who actually really knows something about the topic, like an artist or a composer or musician or whatever. But I think that's going to be the hardest nut to crack. But I also think that some of this has got a very long trajectory. The number one priority for this administration in the arts, bar none, is restoring quality sequential arts education to the public school system with $23 million of baseline money every single year. So it's a long arc, but I also just want to say one thing, which I was talking to a woman who does social media for the NAACP, and I was talking to her about this question of diversity within cultural institutions. And I was saying it's very hard, to recruit and et cetera. And she said, well, what about social workers or community organizers or school teachers? These are very diverse jobs that don't make a lot of money. So don't tell me that people won't take a job because it's not paying enough money, because those other jobs are explicitly understood to be giving back to the community. So when will we get to the point in the cultural world where it's expressly understood to be giving back to the community to work at a cultural organization? That's not the way it's felt because people don't see cultural organizations as serving that kind of same social service.
Great. Thanks. I think we want to open up the floor to some questions from our audience.
Hello. Hi, my name is Rhonda. I did have a question for the panel. In the absence of accountability, because you had a great example with accountability, how do we get people to just naturally hire and promote diversity in their organizations? I'm getting the sense that it doesn't cross their minds unless someone pushes that agenda.
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, I do think somebody has to raise it for it to be on people's minds, right? But I don't think you have to be in HR or diversity to think about how you can advance diversity. The other thing I would say is that, to Eulas's point, talking about the different resource groups, or we call them communities at Bloomberg, employee resource groups, affinity groups, they're great at recruiting. And also, Tom made the point of how, diverse people have diverse networks, right? So if you're leveraging employee networks, both internally and then their external networks, that's a way to get it done. And if you have a group of active individuals that want to see more people that look like them, or that don't look like them, but that, people that expect diversity. I think especially, at a company like ours, 50% of our employees are like millennials. And they grew up with diversity. A lot of us here did not grow up with diversity. I did not necessarily always expect diversity. But I think, younger generations expect it. So if you can be the best and brightest with any description, and expect diversity and want diversity for your work environment. So it doesn't have to be driven from the top, but when there is accountability, of course you have a greater, opportunity for success.
If I might add
Sure,
just
please.
one point, I think in a lot of our work with companies, it's very true that everyone from the top to the very bottom care deeply about this. I would not say that they know how to change it, and I think a lot of our work is making that accessible to them. And sort of, I'll give you a great example. One of the programs that we run is called the Web Development Fellowship, and in the last year we had a cohort of 25 individuals from across New York City who had zero background in technology, and we wanted to ensure that, one, with training and a significant investment from the city, that they would be employed at tech companies and tech jobs in New York City at salaries of $70,000 and over at the end of that. One of those individuals was named Sebastian, and Sebastian grew up in Brooklyn, one of 6 kids, did not finish college. Again, none of these individuals finished college. And we took them through a training and then handed them to one of our partners. And we said, we are giving each of these individuals a 12-week apprenticeship. There's no requirement to hire. In fact, that is not necessary. Bring this individual inside your company. And when we did that, these companies all came back to us in great numbers saying, this is the smartest person we've seen in a very long time. They are incredibly smart, they are incredibly capable. We want to hire more of them. But what we realized in bringing this individual on is that Sebastian would not have met 5 of our 6 hiring criteria. In fact, he would not have even made it in the door through an application. And it is only through that process that we, 1, demonstrate what's possible, and 2, rewrite the hiring practices to ensure that this is done at scale and done without us. Will only work if we build something that is functional far beyond any workforce program.
This is a problem over and over again. You hear, well, how'd you get the job? Well, I talked to it was my aunt who knew somebody at the company and got me the interview, right? So so people don't understand, I think, often that what they're doing is a positive thing for a friend of the family is actually creating inequity. Yeah, and so how do you get people to just wrap their mind around that? I think people often are people with good intentions, and do things that cause that.
Yeah, and similarly, the problem is somewhat definitional, because a lot of people in positions of authority in a lot of these companies don't believe they have a diversity problem. So the people that raise the issue and push the issue have to define the issue. So I was given this example earlier in conversation with the rest of the panelists. I was in a room once with 25 or so business leaders, where there was an Indian person, 3 women, and African American person and 1 Chinese person. And the rest of the people in the room were white men, and they felt that the organization, that was essentially the senior-most people in the organization, of about 600 people, was diverse. Those viewpoints are represented in the room. And there's some survey data that talks about how if you ask populations of black people what a diverse workforce looks like, they're looking for minimum 10%, 25%, significant numbers of human beings, and often other people are uncomfortable. That seems like too many. So to me, it's like the story about the Google person who's supposed to hire 1. I mean, it's a laudable goal on some level, but it really moves no needle, right? And if that looks like success to someone, if that's the definition of it, if that's a job description, it's like the conversation is really, we got to go back and start the conversation over again. It's from a representation and an inclusion standpoint. As Tom was saying, it's not supposed to be a numbers game, but it's really a numbers game on some level. And so you're saying, when would it just be a natural thing to have happen? It's a natural thing to have happen when people that are in the hiring authority view it as a natural thing to have happen. And many of the times, we won't get there until many of those people are themselves diverse.
That's right.
There's another question back
There's
there.
one question here and then one on the other side.
Thank you. My name's Tim Simons. I have a couple of questions for you guys, so I'm going to read them through. And you've kind of touched on it, but I want you to go a little deeper this time. What does your employer's operations and staffing look like in order for you to not have a job? Right? So what is the institution going to look like? And it doesn't have to just be your institution, but your industry. What does it have to begin to look like? The push for, another one is, the push for diversity has shifted and morphed over the years, but the genesis of that was always about race and gender. That's where it started. With the inclusion of the LGBT community, which may include white men, how do we ensure the genesis is not lost in this broader definition? And given that the genesis is still very much real and relevant today, where people of color and don't have the opportunities that existed, that others have. And along those lines, many hiring decisions are still made within the same, what we term the good old boy network, which many women and minorities are still excluded from. What penalties or incentives do institutions provide to ensure that it does not occur?
So, Kristen, do you have a perspective on some of the issues you've seen?
Yes, so those are all really great questions and important ones. I'll start with the last one, which is how do we ensure it's not a good old boys network? And again, I think this comes back to accountability and creating an open dialogue, both inside these companies. The people working inside these companies have to put pressure both to the top and at the very bottom levels to make this happen. And at the same time, the sort of general public has to be both made aware of the numbers in this numbers game and what's at stake. And I think we've seen many moves in this direction from the tech sector in recent years. Companies like Google, I keep coming back to Google because we all know them and use them, have instituted new hiring practices. They've done bias surveys of all of their employees so that they uncover unconscious bias among employees. But where that all started was from a healthy dialogue and quite frankly, intense pressure at all levels. And I think that is healthy, that's needed. And we cannot stop that until we are not here, until we're no longer talking about this, until there are no more panels on this subject.
So I'd like to take a stab at the question around LGBTQ. I think, to me, the premise of the question suggests that the inclusion of a focus on that issue is somehow dilutive of addressing racial and gender diversity issues, and I don't know why that needs to be true. I think one of the things that is lost sometimes in the sort of the business case for diversity is how deeply wrong exclusionary practices are. That in addition to being irrational from a business perspective and from an efficiency perspective, they're morally inconsistent with everything that we believe as a country. And so as we make decisions to try to address issues of exclusion and promote diversity and inclusion, as we identify additional problems, we should be solving all of them. And I don't think that there's a real risk that trying to do that will somehow lessen our effectiveness in addressing other issues about which maybe we have more experience and information. I think, if anything, it will inform how we go about developing solutions for all of those exclusionary challenges that we're facing in the workplace and in academic environments, all of our public institutions and public spaces.
Yeah, and you can't forget about the intersectionality of all of these dimensions,
That's
right?
right.
So within the LGBT community,
Absolutely.
there are African Americans, Latinos. I mean, you can slice in women, of course, you know. So intersectionality comes into play a lot in the work that we do in the D&I space. So, you know, military is another dimension that, you know, as you say, could include white men, right? But again, the military is very diverse. And again, the military brings certain leadership and thought and perspective that we would want in our organization. So we want the best people. And I think, of course, it's not mutually exclusive, right, to be diverse and have the best people. And I really think that in this day and age, most people identify with multiple dimensions, and they bring that to the workplace. And if they can be their authentic selves in the workplace with all the dimensions that they bring, then when you think about what type of environment you have, what type of productivity you have, and what type of culture that's created to attract people, the best and brightest, no matter how they identify, you know, that to me is the goal. That's the brass ring. You know, and I do think, you know, I say at times, oh, I'd love to work myself out of a job. But that implies that there's a finish line, and my chairman often is heard saying, you know, this is a race without a finish line. Because, you know, if you say, okay, well, you know, let's pick African American as 13% of the country, so if we have 13%, we're done. Why can't we have 14%, right? You know, so if you're setting limits, you know, they can be viewed as goals or they can be viewed as limits, right? So I think there are always going to be things that we aspire to, and even we have publicly stated that we'd like for our senior leaders to be 30% gender diverse, right? But we can use that as something that we're working towards, but then we don't stop there either, right? So I don't think there's this perfect, okay, you know, we all can go home, because it's something that there really is no finish line in my mind.
If I could just also, I mean, one of the things in your series of good questions was the work, so this whole question or focus on diversity was something that was very, very present in the late 60s, early 70s. Actually, things changed quite a bit. You know, El Museo, Studio Museum, these were founded, these museums in the cultural sector. But to think that the work is anywhere close to being finished is incorrect. But I have to say I'm more optimistic this time for a particular reason, which is sort of the demographic change in the country. And if you look at, you know, the city is 67% people of color now, right? This administration is, you know, majority women and people of color in the, might not look from this panel, but it is. That, you know, you're not going to be able to get elected to be president in 15 years without substantial, diverse support, right? This is the trend that everybody is seeing now. So it's not just the right thing to do, you know, philosophically, which it is, or spiritually, which it is, but it's also, there's a business reason, and there's a reason why cultural institutions have to think about the future of their audiences, et cetera. So I don't know what the rest of the panel thinks, but I'm actually optimistic, and I can promise you, as long as I'm commissioner, this is not going to be taken off the table as a major priority. So I can promise you for the next 6 years, right? That we will be talking about this all the time because of the appalling results we got from our survey.
Good. Is there a question over here?
Hi, this question's mostly for Tom because I know most about this within the cultural sector, but if you can also speak to that, that'd be great. I'm curious about the labor issues that kind of tie into this, especially, you know, when coming to the cultural sector with a diverse workforce, the idea of people of color and people from different socioeconomic backgrounds being disadvantaged because of their reliance on, say, unpaid interns or, you know, volunteer work, or things that people literally cannot afford to do, and how, you know, you in all of your roles are working to change that.
Yeah, so It's absolutely a good, so the traditional moment, there's a crisis, oh my God, somebody's leaving. It's like, oh, let's hire the intern, she's so awesome. It's like, yeah, that's the person who could afford to work there for nothing, right? And so that's a socioeconomic barrier. So there are some very successful models. We had one at the Queen's Museum where it was a $10,000, it wasn't a job, it was a paid $10,000 fellowship, and they got responsibilities, they got to do shows at the end, and everybody got jobs. And in fact, one of them is working for me now at Cultural Affairs because she was so good I brought her over. But look, we've got a couple of RFPs out there. There's a theater sub-district council. I don't know if people in the theater community, but we have a couple of $1 million of grants that are going to go to diversifying workforce. One of the things we're really looking at is those paid apprenticeships, paid unions in theater could be much more diverse. They're looking at ways to get people into the apprenticeship programs. Look, it's a big problem, and again, that's one of these we're talking about that positive problem. Oh, yeah, she's wonderful, and she's, my niece, I'm going to get her an internship at some cool cultural institution. You don't realize that that's an obstacle for another person getting that job. So I think it's a good question. There's a lot to do on it, but I think every time cultural institutions rely on free internships, they have to look themselves in the mirror and understand what they're doing in terms of the job force development.
And the same problem exists in a different form in the tech sector, in that they're actually really great internships. We have tech internships that are offering $5,000 bonuses just to be there for the summer. But the reality is, when you look at entry-level jobs in the tech sector, it is those internships, and those internships are sourced exclusively from 5 schools. And if you do not go to college, or if you are not enrolled in those 5 schools, and you are not entered into an internship at X company when you are 20 years old, you are not considered for a full-time position. And that is a very dangerous pipeline problem that we have to solve. And again, we are working very closely to redefine what an internship or paid apprenticeship looks like, how we recruit for them, and how we make them accessible to broader populations.
Certainly the shift in the legal market post-2008 has radically reshaped how new lawyers obtain full-time employment after graduation and while they're waiting for bar results, or even within the months after they get their bar results. Eulas, you want to comment on that at all? I mean, there is a heavy reliance on postgraduate fellowships that are either low paid or can be characterized almost as working in the public interest, and so they're unpaid sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I feel a little bit more positive about those positions, because it used to be true that students would come out of law school and it would be very difficult for them to work in public interest organizations because they didn't have the proper training, and those organizations couldn't support, they couldn't pay a young law graduate to essentially learn on the job for 2 years. So they'd send you off to a firm for 2 years, whether or not you really wanted to work in the private sector, to become trained as a lawyer, and then you could then apply for a job at ACLU or where else you really wanted to start your career. But the contraction kind of created this availability of law school graduates, many of whom in the first place wanted to work in public interest jobs. And this gave them some support and an opportunity to develop those skills so that then the public interest organizations would feel more comfortable hiring them a year or 2 out. And so lots of the law schools were, essentially extending support to the public interest organizations to support the students for that period. And I think, much of the legal industry or the legal employment industry has kind of thought about it as sort of gaming the employment statistics, but in many cases it's really allowed these students to launch the kinds of careers that they really went to law school for in the first place. So many students, they go to law school with the intention of having social justice careers, but they end up in law firms because one of the massive affordability and access problem in law school, and then secondarily because they used to come out and the traditional medium or large law firm job was just much easier to achieve, and now we have many more of these sort of internship, apprenticeship, fellowship type starts to a legal career, which are not which are financially difficult for law schools, for law students, but often result in more sort of fulfilling legal careers. And so lots of law schools, including ours, have programs to kind of help them financially during that period. But I ultimately think it's a good thing for the students and the graduates.
Great.
Yeah, I would just add that we have, most of our internships are paid, but we do have them at the high school level as well as the college level, and that we do have a very broad list of core schools, so it's not the 5, IVs. We have an extensive relationship with the CUNY system. We have core schools that are SUNY schools besides the other schools, so I think that's important. We also have a policy that direct relatives cannot be hired, so that it's not, hey, Aunt Erika, can you get me a job? So, so that's part of our company's policy and approach to hiring as well. And we are launching an apprentice program in London that you don't have to go to, Cambridge or Oxford or any city university to be a part of. So we're trying different things along those lines to address in a different way what you're talking about.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, there's a question in the back. There's 2 in the back there.
CUNY is, that's where they're at.
Yes.
That's where this works.
Hi, thank you. I work at a small tech startup, 16 people, and I was wondering if any of you have advice for building a culture of diversity at the onset of a company. It's something that we all value, but I'm hoping for some tactical advice on bringing the leadership into this initiative and helping build a culture of diversity from the onset.
I'm happy to speak to that. I know you guys have all done this inside a company. I think, for a lot of our partners and a lot of small startups, this is very difficult because the hiring is you're building something with your college roommate or your cousin. And I think, again, it's this public dialogue that's helped to create a tough conversation with many executives that did not want to have this conversation. Creating a safe place to have that conversation, to talk about a diversity of opinions, about how best to hire individuals, building out brand new hiring practices is really tough. And from my experience, young tech companies don't necessarily have a respect for hiring practices and policies. It really is, let's just build this and get rich in many cases. And I think, we've learned the hard way, seeing this industry grow over the past several years, that is absolutely important. And as I spoke to before, the best products and services are those that are built with a diversity of opinions and backgrounds. And I think, making that very clear, bringing in users for user testing that are reflective of the community in which we live, incredibly important. Bringing in individuals that have a diverse background, incredibly important. And since CUNY was just mentioned, doing recruiting in a different way, I think, is incredibly important. Especially for startups, there's a real opportunity in finding hungry, young talent, really diverse talent. CUNY schools across New York City represent, a hugely diverse audience. They are oftentimes first generation, they are hungry, hard workers, and the perfect candidates for startups. Bringing one individual in, 2, 3, 4, growing that base is going to be critical for changing a culture.
But if you want to attract top diverse talent, you need to have some diversity within the organization.
That's right.
I would like to just repeat the word CUNY one more time.
CUNY.
Yes.
It is our future.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Great.
So this was wonderful. Thank you. And Deborah?
Thank you all so much for your wisdom and your thoughtfulness.